The dust tasted of endings. It coated Clara's tongue, settled in the folds of her worn dress, and painted the setting sun a bruised, bloody red. Beneath her, the horse, a creature of bone and hide and failing will, gave a shuddering sigh and went down. No warning. One moment it was stumbling forward. The next it was a heap in the unforgiving grit of the desert floor. She did not cry out. The sound had been baked out of her throat miles ago. She slid from the saddle, her limbs stiff and aching, and patted the animal's heaving side. Its eyes were glassy, filmed over with a dull resignation she understood completely. She unstrapped the canteen, a pathetic slosh of water remaining, and poured it into her cupped hand, offering it to the dying beast. It was a useless gesture, a prayer to a god who had long since turned his back on this scorched piece of earth. The horse's muzzle didn't move. Clara left it there. There was no time for sentiment, no room for a grief she couldn't afford. Her gaze fixed on the horizon, where a collection of faint, jagged shapes promised either salvation or a different kind of damnation. Mercy's Edge. The name was a cruel joke, but it was the only one on the map she had managed to steal. In her hand, she clutched a small, tattered piece of lace, the last remnant of a bridal veil. It was once white, as pure as the lie she was about to tell. Now it was stained with sweat and dirt, a sorry flag of surrender. She had torn it from her hair 3 days ago, leaving the rest of the ridiculous gown in a heap for the coyotes. This small piece she kept, a reminder of what she was running from, a penance. The last few miles were a waking nightmare. The soles of her city shoes, never meant for such terrain, were worn to paper. Every step was a fresh agony, a conversation with the stones and thorns that littered her path. The silence of the desert was immense, broken only by the rasp of her own breathing and the whisper of the wind. It was a silence that held judgment, that stripped a person down to their most essential parts, fear and the stubborn refusal to die. By the time she reached the edge of town, the last of the sun's light had bled away, leaving the sky a deep, star-pricked indigo. Mercy's Edge was not a town so much as a collection of weary-looking buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness. A single main street, rutted and deep with dust, ran between a saloon leaking loud, tinny piano music, a general store, a blacksmith's forge now dark and silent, and a stark white church whose steeple seemed to poke accusingly at the heavens. She pushed open the door to the general store, a small bell announcing her arrival with a jangle that felt impossibly loud. The air inside was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and lye soap. A handful of people turned to look at her, their faces hard and unsmiling in the lantern light. A woman behind the counter, with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and a mouth set in a permanent line of disapproval, ceased measuring out flour to stare. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Her voice was as dry as the dust on Clara's dress. Clara swallowed, her throat clicking. I'm looking for work, and a place to stay, just for a while." The woman's eyes traveled over her, taking in the ruined shoes, the haunted look in her eyes, the single, expensive-looking but dirt-caked dress. It was a ledger of Clara's desperation, and the woman, Mrs. Lowry, read it with an expert's eye. "We don't get many travelers this way," Mrs. Lowry said, her tone making it clear that this was not a complaint. "Especially not ladies, alone." "My husband," Clara began, the lie she had rehearsed for 100 miles finally taking voice. It felt foreign and brittle on her tongue. "He passed back east. I have no one left. I'm making my way to California, to distant cousins. My name is Clara Boone." The silence that followed was heavy with suspicion. A man in the corner, wearing a sheriff's star on his dusty vest, narrowed his eyes. 2 women near the fabric bolts, their faces pinched with piety, exchanged a look that spoke volumes. In a town like this, a woman alone was a problem. A pretty woman alone was a threat. "A widow," Mrs. Lowry repeated flatly, without an ounce of sympathy. Tragic. Clara said nothing. She simply stood there, a specter of exhaustion, and let their judgment wash over her. It was a familiar feeling. She had been judged her entire life, by her father, by society, by the man she was supposed to marry. This was no different, just a harsher, dustier version of the same cage. Finally, with a long-suffering sigh that suggested she was taking on the world's greatest burden, Mrs. Lowry nodded toward the back of the store. I need someone to mend grain sacks and sweep up. There's a cot in the storeroom. It's not much. It's enough, Clara whispered, the relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, the woman sniffed. You'll work for your keep, sun up to sundown, and you'll keep to yourself. This is a decent town. Clara nodded, her gaze cast downward. She understood the unspoken rules. Be invisible, be silent, be grateful. She had been practicing for this role her entire life. It was 2 days later when she first saw him. Silas Kane. He moved with a quiet intensity that drew the eye. A man set apart from the others. He was tall and lean, his face weathered by the sun to the color of old leather, with the lines etched around his eyes that spoke of things seen and not forgotten. He walked with a pronounced limp, favoring his right leg, a flaw that did nothing to diminish the air of coiled danger that clung to him like his own shadow. The talk in the saloon, which she could hear through the thin walls of her storeroom at night, would quiet when he entered. The men gave him a wide berth. The women watched him with a mixture of fear and a strange, hungry curiosity. Rumor had it he'd killed a man, right in the middle of the street, over a card game or a misplaced word. No one knew for sure. No one dared to ask. He came into the store for a bag of coffee and a length of rope. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found her immediately where she sat in the corner, stitching a tear in a canvas sack. His gaze wasn't leering like that of the other men. It was something else, appraising, intense. It felt as if he were looking past the carefully constructed wall of Clara Boone, humble widow, and seeing the raw, terrified creature hiding behind it. She quickly dropped her eyes to her work, her needle suddenly clumsy in her trembling fingers. She could feel his stare on her for the entire time he was in the store, a physical weight on the back of her neck. She made a point to avoid him after that. When she saw him on the street, she would cross to the other side or duck back into the store. She could not afford the attention of a man like that. She could not afford the attention of any man. Her safety lay in being forgettable, a gray moth in a world of dust. But the world did not always allow for such invisibility. One evening, as she was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store, a drunkard, one of the regulars from the saloon, stumbled out and blocked her path. He was a big man, smelling of sour whiskey and unwashed linen. "Well now, look what we got here," he slurred, a gap-toothed grin spreading across his face. "The little widow bird. Ain't you lonely all by yourself, little bird?" Clara tried to step around him. "Excuse me, sir." He grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into her flesh. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. It was a familiar terror, the feeling of a man's strength being used as a weapon, a cage. Her breath hitched, and the world narrowed to his leering face, the scent of his breath. "No need to be in such a hurry," he chuckled. "Let old Jed buy you a drink." "No, thank you," she said, her voice tight, trying to pull her arm away. His grin vanished. "Don't you be high and mighty with me, a woman like you, all alone. You need a man to look after you." His grip tightened, and a wave of black memory threatened to pull her under. The smell of brandy, a hand twisting her arm, a voice whispering threats against her skin. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. And then, a new voice cut through the haze, low and steady as a death knell. "Let her go." Clara's eyes snapped open. Silas Kane stood there, not 5 feet away, He hadn't seemed to come from anywhere. He was just suddenly present, a still point in the swirling dust. His hand rested lightly on the Colt peacemaker at his hip. He wasn't looking at the drunk. His gray eyes were fixed on her, on the man's hand clamped around her wrist. The drunk, Jed, seemed to shrink. He licked his lips, his bravado evaporating like a raindrop on a hot skillet. "Now, Kane, this ain't none of your business. Just having a friendly chat with the lady." "I only say things once," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower. It was the quietest, most menacing sound Clara had ever heard. Jed released her wrist as if it were a hot coal. He threw up his hands and backed away, stumbling toward the safety of the saloon. "No harm done, no harm done." Clara stood frozen, rubbing the red marks on her skin, her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She should thank him. Politeness, the shield she wore every day, demanded it. But the words wouldn't come. To thank him would be to acknowledge a debt, to create a connection. She couldn't, she wouldn't. She turned without a word, grabbed her broom, and fled into the sanctuary of the store, the bell above the door marking her retreat. She didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her until the door swung shut. She knew what he had seen in that moment she was caught. Not indignation, not anger, just pure, unadulterated terror. The kind a person only earns one way, and he had seen her try to bury it the second she was free. That night, the dreams came for her. They were always the same, a kaleidoscope of horror that her waking mind fought to suppress. The scent of cigar smoke and expensive cologne, the grand ballroom of her father's house, chandeliers dripping with light like frozen tears, the face of Mr. Alistair Finch, the railroad baron her father had sold her to, his eyes, small and dark like a pig's, roaming over her body as if she were a piece of livestock he had just purchased, the suffocating weight of the wedding dress, a prison of silk and lace. Then the fire, the desperate, wild act of a cornered animal, the smell of burning velvet curtains, the heat, the smoke, the beautiful, destructive chaos that had been her only way out, and always. The end of the dream was the same, a hand, large and heavy, striking her across the face, the crack of it echoing in the darkness, the sound of her own scream, choked off before it could fully form. She awoke with a gasp, drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom sting still smarting on her cheek. The storeroom was pitch black, silent save for the frantic beating of her own heart. She scrambled for the needle and thread she kept on the crate beside her cot. Under the faint moonlight filtering through a grimy window, she began to stitch. She grabbed a spare burlap sack and pushed the needle through the coarse fabric, over and over again. The methodical, repetitive motion was an anchor. The sharp prick of the needle against her fingertips was a real, grounding pain. It was a pain she could control. She stitched until the memories receded, until her mind was numb, until the tips of her fingers were raw and bleeding, tiny red blossoms on the rough brown fabric. After that night, Silas Kane became a more frequent visitor to Mrs. Lowry's general store. He never seemed to be buying much. A tin of peaches, some tobacco, once, just a single nail. But he always seemed to time his visits for when Clara was there, sorting beans or stacking tins on the shelves. Their interactions were clipped, brittle things, fraught with unspoken tension. "Good morning, Mr. Kane," she would murmur, not meeting his eye. "Ma'am," he would reply, his voice a low rumble. He would watch her as she worked, his gaze steady and unnerving. She moved with a forced, fragile grace, her spine ramrod straight, every gesture a performance of quiet widowhood. He saw the tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. He saw the way she flinched if someone moved too quickly behind her. He saw the deep, bruised-looking shadows under her eyes that no amount of polite decorum could hide. She was a woman wearing a costume, and he could see the ill-fitting seams. She was polite, always polite. She would answer his questions about the price of flour or the availability of new stock with a cool, distant efficiency. But he could feel the wall behind her words, a fortress of fear and secrets. He saw right through it, and she knew he did. It terrified her. Her past was a ghost that walked beside her every day. She remembered the cold, calculating look in her father's eyes as he'd signed the marriage contract. He had called it a strategic alliance, a merger of his shipping fortune with Alistair Finch's railroad empire. He had not called it selling his only daughter. Finch was twice her age, a cruel man whose previous 2 wives had died under circumstances whispered about but never investigated. Clara had seen the bruises on the arms of his house staff, had heard the stories of his temper. She had pleaded with her father, but he had been immovable. "You will do your duty to this family," he had said, his voice like chipping ice. The escape had been an act of pure desperation. The night before the wedding, with the house full of guests and the air thick with celebratory cigar smoke, she had locked herself in the library. Her hands shook so badly she could barely strike the match. But she had. She had touched the flame to the heavy velvet curtains her mother had so loved. In the ensuing panic, as servants shouted and bells rang, she had slipped out a side door, wearing nothing but a simple traveling dress and carrying a small satchel with the few pieces of her mother's jewelry she had managed to hide. She had run until her lungs burned, a pillar of smoke rising behind her, erasing the life she was supposed to have led. She never looked back, but she knew they would look for her. Men like her father and Alistair Finch did not suffer such embarrassments lightly. They would have sent men, bounty men who would not be gentle when they found her. Every new face in Mercy's Edge was a potential threat, every stranger's glance a possible recognition. One night, the weight of it all became too much, the constant fear, the gnawing hunger that was never quite satisfied, the bone-deep loneliness. It pressed down on her until she felt she would shatter. She slipped out of the store and walked down to the small, sluggish river that marked the town's southern edge. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, its weak light turning the water to shimmering ink. She sat on the bank, hidden by a cluster of willows, and for the first time since she had fled, she allowed herself to cry. It was not a storm of grief, but a silent, steady leaking of despair. The tears traced clean paths through the dust on her cheeks, each one a testament to a loss too profound for words. She wept for the girl she had been, for the mother she had lost, for the future that had been stolen from her. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders shaking in the cool night air. She didn't know how long he had been there. She didn't hear him approach, his limping gait making no sound on the soft earth. She only knew that suddenly he was there, standing a few feet away, a dark shape against the star-dusted sky. Her tears stopped instantly, frozen by a fresh spike of fear. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. He didn't move closer. He simply stood there, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the river. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He didn't press her for the secrets she guarded so fiercely. He just stood in the quiet darkness, sharing the silence with her. It was a strange, unexpected courtesy, a granting of space. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice quiet. "It'll be a cold ride back." She didn't know what he meant or where he was going. She just nodded, unable to speak. He turned and began to walk away, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows. She stood there, trembling, watching him go. Then she noticed it. Draped over a low-hanging willow branch beside her was his coat. It was heavy wool, worn and smelling faintly of leather and wood smoke. He had left it for her. She stared at it for a long time, a dark, solid shape in the moonlight. It was a gesture of kindness, a thing she had not known in so long she had forgotten what it felt like. And because she had forgotten, it did not feel like a kindness. It felt like a threat, a question she did not know how to answer, a crack in the wall she had built so carefully around herself. With trembling hands, She reached out and touched the rough fabric. It was still warm from his body. The sky began to curdle 3 days after Silas left his coat by the river. It started as a faint, yellowish haze on the horizon, a stain that bled into the brilliant blue until the whole world looked sickly. The wind picked up, not with the clean sweep of a prairie breeze, but with a low moan that rattled the windows of the general store and sent dust devils dancing down the main street. The townsfolk hurried indoors, barring their doors against the coming fury. They knew the signs. Clara, however, did not have the luxury of shelter. A shipment of flour had arrived, and Mrs. Lowry, whose disposition soured with the weather, insisted the sacks be moved from the wagon into the storeroom immediately. Clara worked with a frantic, desperate energy, her body already aching with a fever heat that had been building behind her eyes all morning. A shiver that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature traced its icy fingers down her spine. Each 50-pound sack was a dead weight, a personal battle against the dizziness that threatened to send her to her knees. Her head throbbed in time with the first fat drops of rain that began to spatter in the dust, each one leaving a dark, spreading circle like a tiny wound. She refused to stop. To stop was to be weak, and weakness was a sickness this town would not tolerate. It was a vulnerability she could not afford. So she pushed on, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the world tilting and swaying around her like a ship in a gale. She managed to haul the last sack inside just as the heavens opened, the rain coming down not in drops but in solid, wind-whipped sheets. The noise on the tin roof was deafening, 1,000 tiny hammers trying to beat their way in. Leaning against the storeroom wall, her lungs burning, she felt a wave of nausea so profound it stole her breath. The room spun violently, the shelves of tins and bolts of fabric blurring into a meaningless smear of color. She stumbled out the back door, seeking air, and collapsed in the muddy alley behind the shop. The cold mud was a shock against her feverish skin, but she could not bring herself to move. The darkness at the edge of her vision rushed in, and she knew no more. She came to in pieces. First, a sense of warmth, a heavy weight over her that smelled of wool and wood smoke. Then, a dull, rhythmic rocking. She was moving. A flicker of consciousness revealed a rough, stubbled jawline, the steady beat of a heart against her ear. Panic, primal and absolute, clawed its way up her throat. She tried to scream, but only a dry, rattling croak emerged. She was being carried. A man. The realization sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her, momentarily clearing the fog from her mind. She began to struggle, a weak, frantic thrashing that accomplished nothing. "Easy now," a low voice rumbled, the one she had heard in her waking nightmares, the one that belonged to Silas Kane. "Just hold still." His words were not a comfort. They were a command, and they plunged her back into the blackness of her deepest fears. This was how it happened. A moment of weakness, a pretense of kindness, and then the trap would spring. When she woke again, it was to stillness and the soft crackle of a fire. For a moment, she thought she was back in her cot in the storeroom, but the air was different, cleaner. It smelled of pine and burning cedar, not of dust and mice. She was lying in a bed, a real bed with a mattress stuffed with straw and covered by a thick quilt. A fire danced in a stone hearth across the room, casting long, flickering shadows on the rough-hewn pine walls. The room was small, sparse, containing only the bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding a handful of books and some tins of food. She sat up, her head swimming. She was wearing her own dress, though it was damp and muddy, and she was alone. But the fact remained. She was in his cabin, in his bed. Fury, hot and sharp, burned through the fever. It was a clean, familiar anger, a welcome shield against the terror that churned beneath it. The door creaked open, and he entered, carrying a steaming bowl. He moved with that same quiet intensity, his limp more pronounced after his walk in the storm. He stopped when he saw her sitting up, his gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. "You're awake," he said. It was not a question. "What am I doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a rage that was 90% fear. "You had no right to bring me here." He set the bowl on the table. "You collapsed. The fever's high. You would have died in that mud." "That is none of your concern," she spat, pulling the quilt up to her chin like a barricade. "You think because you helped me once, you can just take me? You think I'm some stray you can claim? I am not your charity, Mr. Kane, and I will not be your prisoner." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unchanging. He did not get angry. He did not argue. He simply absorbed her accusations with a stillness that was more unnerving than any rage. "This is broth," he said, nodding toward the bowl. "You need to eat. The door ain't locked." And with that, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. She was left alone in the sudden, ringing silence, her accusations hanging in the air like smoke. She listened, her body coiled like a spring, waiting for the sound of a bar sliding into place. But it never came. He had told the truth. She was not a prisoner, and that simple fact confused her more than any act of violence could have. Days passed in a feverish haze. He would leave food and fresh water on the table and disappear for hours, tending to his horses or whatever other business he had. She drank the broth, and later, ate the stew he left, her hunger overriding her pride. She slept, long and deep, her body slowly fighting off the sickness. In her more lucid moments, she would watch the world from the cabin's single window. His homestead was nestled in a small, sheltered canyon a mile from town. It was stark and lonely, but there was a quiet, rugged peace to it that she had never known. The wind in the pines sounded like the whisper of a gentle sea, a sound that soothed the ragged edges of her soul. She learned things about him in his absence. She learned them from the objects in his cabin. There were no decorations, no portraits, nothing of a life lived with others. But on the shelf, next to a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's tragedies, was a small, crudely carved wooden horse. It was a child's toy, its lines smoothed by countless hours in a small hand. It seemed impossibly out of place in this Spartan, masculine world. One evening, when her fever had finally broken and she was strong enough to sit by the fire, he spoke of it. He had been cleaning his rifle. The methodical click and slide of the mechanism, the only sound in the room. "My brother, Thomas, carved that," he said, his eyes on his work. He was good with his hands, thought he could see the shape of a thing inside the wood before he even started cutting. Clara said nothing, sensing that this was a door opening into a place he rarely, if ever, visited. He was just a boy, 17. Silas continued, his voice low and rough. Went to work in the silver mines up in Colorado. Said he was going to make his fortune and buy our mother a house with a real porch. He stopped, his hands stilling on the rifle. The whole damn mountain came down on them. 100 men, they never even found his body. He fell silent, and the weight of his grief filled the small cabin. She saw it then, the source of the quiet fury in his eyes. It was not malice, it was pain, a deep, unhealed wound that he carried with him every day. "I was supposed to be there with him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I was away. I haven't been home since." A bond, thin and fragile as a spider's thread, formed between them in that moment. They were two ghosts, haunted by the past, hiding out at the edge of the world. She did not offer him sympathy. She knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he would hate it. Instead, she simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. The tension in the cabin grew thick and heavy in the following days. With her health returning, the space seemed to shrink. They moved around each other with a careful, guarded choreography, their bodies acutely aware of each other's presence. A brush of hands as he passed her a plate. A shared glance across the fire. Each was a small spark in a room full of dry tinder. She found herself watching him, The way he moved, the quiet competence of his hands, the sadness that settled in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. One night, she woke to the sound of a bottle clinking against a glass. The fire had burned down to embers, but it cast enough light for her to see him sitting at the table, his back to her. He was shirtless, and in the dim light, she saw the landscape of his back, a road map of scars, old and new, a particularly nasty one. A puckered, angry starburst on his left shoulder blade. Looked fresh. He was dabbing at it with a rag soaked in whiskey. He was drunk. She could tell by the slight unsteadiness of his hand, the way he held himself with a rigid, forced control. He must have felt her gaze on him, because he turned his head slowly and looked at her over his shoulder. His eyes were dark, clouded with alcohol and something else, something raw and desperate. "It's an old wound," he said, his voice thick. "Sometimes it opens up again." She swung her legs out of the bed and walked toward him, moved by an impulse she didn't understand. She took the rag from his unresisting hand. "Let me," she whispered. She stood behind him, dabbing gently at the wound. It was an old bullet hole, poorly healed. His skin was hot to the touch. She could feel the coiled strength in his shoulders, the tension radiating from him in waves. He smelled of whiskey, sweat, and a deep, masculine loneliness that called to her own. He was so still. He might have been carved from stone. When she finished, she didn't move away. Her hands rested on his shoulders. She felt a tremor run through him. He turned on the chair, his knees brushing against her dress, and looked up at her. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions: pain, desire, a bitter self-loathing. Before she could think, before she could retreat behind her wall of fear, he reached up, tangled a hand in her hair, and pulled her down to him. His kiss was not gentle. It was brutal, punishing. It tasted of whiskey and regret. It was the kiss of a man who had been starved for too long, a desperate, angry claiming. For a split second, her body responded, a jolt of pure, traitorous heat flashing through her. Then the terror hit, the memory of another man's mouth on hers, another man's hands holding her captive. She tore her mouth from his and slapped him, the sound sharp and ugly in the quiet room. Her handprint stood out, stark and white, against the dark stubble of his cheek. She was trembling from head to toe, her breath coming in shallow, panicked sobs. He let her go instantly. The desperate haze cleared from his eyes, replaced by a look of profound, weary shame. He looked at his hands as if he didn't recognize them. He didn't say a word. He just let her go. She scrambled back to the bed and huddled under the quilt, her heart hammering against her ribs. He remained at the table, a solitary figure in the dying firelight, his head bowed in a silence more damning than any apology. She left the next morning before he was awake, slipping out of the cabin as the sun cast its first pale, gray light over the canyon. She did not take his coat. The walk back to town was cold and long, but she welcomed the chill. It helped to numb the turmoil inside her. Mercy's edge seemed different. The looks she received were no longer just suspicious. They were openly hostile. Women pulled their children closer as she passed. Men watched her with a new speculative lewdness in their eyes. When she entered the general store, Mrs. Lowry fixed her with a gaze as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. "So, you're back," the woman said, her voice dripping with contempt. "I was ill," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Kane was kind enough to—" "I know what Mr. Kane was." "Mrs.?" Lowry interrupted. Her lips pursed into a thin, merciless line. "And so does the rest of this town. We run a decent place here. Miss Boone, we don't hold with women of your sort. The church ladies are in an uproar. They say you're a harlot, living in sin out in that man's cabin." The word struck Clara like a physical blow. Harlot. It was a brand, a stain that could never be washed away. "That's not true," she whispered, her cheeks burning with shame. "It doesn't matter what's true," Mrs. Lowry sniffed. "It only matters what people believe. You've made your bed, girl. Now you can lie in it, just not under my roof. Get your things. You're finished here." Clara didn't beg. She didn't plead. She simply turned, her back straight, and went to the storeroom to collect the few miserable possessions she owned. Her pride was the only thing she had left. She found herself adrift, a pariah in a town that had barely tolerated her to begin with. She resisted the urge to go back to Silas's cabin. To go back would be to admit defeat, to prove the gossips right. It would mean she was truly his, and yet she found herself watching for him. Her eyes scanned the street for his distinctive, limping walk, for the shadow of his horse. When he did ride into town for supplies, she would watch from a distance, a strange, guarded hunger stirring within her. He was a dangerous man, a source of ruin, but he was also the only person who had shown her a sliver of kindness, however rough and complicated it might be. He was the only person who looked at her and saw something other than a widow or a harlot. He saw a secret. He saw the truth. 2 weeks later, another storm blew in, this one a choking, blinding wall of dust. The sky turned a dark, angry orange, and the wind howled like a banshee, scouring the world with sand and grit. In the middle of the chaos, a child went missing. The blacksmith's son, a small boy of 5 named Daniel, had wandered off from his yard. The town, for all its harsh judgment, came together in the crisis. A search party was formed, men on horseback fanning out into the swirling maelstrom, their lanterns bobbing like lost souls in the gloom. Clara joined on foot, tying a scarf over her face. She would not be useless. She would not be a coward. She searched the alleys and the outbuildings, calling the boy's name until her throat was raw. It was a hopeless, desperate act, but she had to do something. Hours passed. The storm raged. Then, a rider emerged from the dust, a small, limp form cradled in his arms. It was Silas. He had found the boy, huddled in a shallow cave by the riverbed. A wave of relief washed over Clara, so potent it made her dizzy. But as he dismounted, she saw him stumble, his face pale and drawn. He set the boy down gently, sending him running to his weeping mother, and then leaned heavily against his horse. "A rattler," he said through gritted teeth, his voice strained. "Struck at me when I reached for the boy. Got me in the calf." Clara didn't hesitate. She ran to him, tearing a strip of fabric from her petticoat. She knelt in the dust, pushing up his pant leg. 2 small, dark puncture wounds were already swelling, the skin around them an ugly, purplish color. He winced as she tied the strip of cloth tightly above the wound, her hands moving with a swift, sure competence she didn't know she possessed. He looked down at her, his face a mask of pain, his eyes clouded but clear. "You're brave, Clara," he rasped out, braver than any of them. The words and the sound of her real name on his lips broke something inside her. No one had ever called her brave. They had called her dutiful, beautiful, willful, ruined, but never brave. A sob, thick and heavy, escaped her lips. She tried to stifle it, but it was followed by another. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the dust and grit. He reached down, his hand rough and calloused, and brushed a tear from her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the world fell away. There was no storm, no town, no judgment. There was only the 2 of them, 2 wounded souls adrift in a sea of pain. His head lowered to hers. Their lips brushed, a soft, questioning touch. Then, as if a dam had broken inside them both, the touch deepened, hardened, clashed. He pulled her up against him, his arms circling her like steel bands, his mouth devouring hers. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of anger and a fierce, undeniable need. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, and for the first time in a lifetime of running, Clara didn't pull away. She let him. She kissed him back. They stood there, locked together in the heart of the storm, and said nothing at all. To wake in his bed by choice was a terrifying new kind of vulnerability. The first time, she had been a patient, a charity case shrouded in the delirium of fever. This time, she was a participant. The scratch of his wool blanket against her skin, the unfamiliar weight of his arm draped loosely over her waist, the scent of him, pine and leather and man, in the pillow beneath her head. It was all a testament to a surrender she did not yet understand. She lay perfectly still in the pre-dawn gray, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, and felt a panic colder than any winter morning. They did not speak of what had happened in the storm. They did not speak of what happened in the night. Their new life in the small cabin was a silent dance of unspoken agreements. She would wake before him and make coffee, the bitter, bracing scent of it filling the small space. He would mend the tack for his horse or sharpen his axe, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a kind of conversation. They ate their meals in a shared silence that was no longer entirely uncomfortable, but thick with the weight of things unasked and unanswered. He never asked who she was running from. He never asked about the nightmares that sometimes made her cry out in her sleep. He simply offered her a space in his world, a quiet harbor, and for that, she was both profoundly grateful and deeply afraid. This fragile peace was built on a foundation of willful ignorance. Their passion, when it took them, was fierce and desperate, a collision of two lonely souls seeking heat in the darkness. It was a language of touch because words were too dangerous. In his arms, she could almost forget the ghost of Alistair Finch, the cold judgment of her father. She could be a different woman, one defined not by her past but by the solid, warm presence of the man beside her. But the fear was always there, a serpent coiled in her belly. She feared what this connection meant, what it would demand of her. She feared the moment he would finally ask her real name, and the moment she would have to lie or tell a truth that would surely drive him away. The town of Mercy's Edge, however, did not deal in unspoken things. News, like a contagion, had spread from the moment she had followed him out of town. It festered in the pews of the stark white church. It was whispered over bolts of calico in the general store, and it was traded like currency in the saloon. Clara Boone, the quiet widow, was now Silas Kane's woman. The brand was absolute, burned into her reputation by the hot iron of gossip. She felt it every time they rode into town for supplies. The women would turn their backs. The men would stare with a new, insolent familiarity. They were outcasts together now, a fact that bound them closer even as it isolated them from the rest of the world. One afternoon, the unofficial word became official. Sheriff Brody rode out to the cabin, his horse kicking up a plume of dust that settled over the small porch. He was a tall, weary-looking man whose face seemed permanently etched with the troubles of his jurisdiction. He dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the sight of Clara shaking a rug out over the porch railing. He gave her a curt, uncomfortable nod before turning his attention to Silas, who had emerged from the barn, his face a mask of cool neutrality. "Silas," the sheriff said, foregoing any pleasantries. "Gotta have a word." Silas leaned against a porch post, crossing his arms over his chest. He did not invite the man to sit. "You've come all this way, Brody. Might as well speak your piece." The sheriff took off his hat and wiped a sleeve across his sweating brow. He pointedly did not look at Clara, who had frozen. The rug clutched in her hands like a shield. "Word's come down from the territorial marshal. They're looking for a woman, a runaway from back east. Name of Fairchild. Seems she's wanted for arson and theft. Fled a marriage contract to a railroad man. A very important, very powerful railroad man." Clara's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt, the steady ground beneath her feet turning to quicksand. Fairchild. They knew her name. "This woman," the sheriff continued, his eyes fixed on Silas, "was last seen heading west. There's a substantial reward, and the charge is serious. The marshal made it clear. Any man found harboring this fugitive is to be considered an accomplice, and the penalty for that, Silas, is a rope." He let the word hang in the hot, still air. Hanging. The word was a physical thing, a tightening in her throat. Silas didn't flinch. His expression did not change by so much as a flicker. "That's a real interesting story, Brody, but I don't see what it has to do with me." The sheriff sighed. A long, tired exhalation. "Don't play the fool with me, Kane. I'm not a fool. The description is close, too close. And you taking up with a strange woman who appears out of nowhere with nothing but the clothes on her back? It raises questions. I'm giving you a warning. As a courtesy, send her on her way, before a bounty man with more greed than sense shows up and decides to ask his questions with a gun." He put his hat back on, turned without another word, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. The silence that followed was the worst yet. It was hollow, brittle, and filled with the monstrous shape of the truth. Clara could not breathe. She could not move. She could only watch Silas's back as he stared out at the trail the sheriff had taken. He still had not looked at her. The next day, the threat ceased to be a story. It became a piece of paper. He had ridden into town alone and returned near sundown, his face grim. He walked into the cabin, pulled a flyer from his saddlebag, and laid it on the small table between them. It was a bounty notice. The paper was cheap, the ink slightly blurred, but the words were clear enough. At the top, in stark black letters, was her name. Not her real name, but a close enough version that it sent a bolt of ice through her veins. And underneath, a crude, wood-cut image of a woman's face, generic and yet horrifyingly familiar. The description was devastatingly accurate. The reward was a fortune, enough to make any desperate man a killer. He didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting. This was it, the moment she had been dreading since the first day she set foot in this unforgiving land. The silence stretched, pulling taut between them until she thought it would snap and tear them both apart. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and devoid of all emotion. "Who are you?" The question was a blade, and it cut through the last of her defenses. She sank into a chair, her body trembling uncontrollably. The lies she had so carefully constructed, the identity of Clara Boone, all of it crumbled to dust. She looked at his face, at the hard lines around his mouth, the stormy gray of his eyes, and she saw a stranger, a man who had taken her in, and whom she had repaid with a lie that could get him killed. The story came out of her in a broken, weeping torrent. She told him everything. Her name, Clarissa Bell Fairchild, her father, a man who saw his daughter as a commodity, the arranged marriage to Alistair Finch, a man whose touch felt like spiders crawling on her skin, whose breath smelled of decay. She told him about the bruises, hidden under long sleeves and high collars. She told him about the suffocating weight of her life, a gilded cage she could no longer bear, and finally, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper, she told him about the fire, the desperate, terrifying act of setting fire to her own prison, the only way she could see to escape. "I didn't steal anything," she sobbed, the words catching in her throat. "Only my own life. That's all I took." When she was finished, the cabin was utterly silent, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing. She looked at him, her vision blurred by tears, searching his face for some sign of, what, forgiveness, understanding, pity? He gave her none of them. His face was a landscape of stone, his eyes unreadable. He just stood there, looking at her, the bounty flyer a stark white accusation on the table between them. He was silent for a minute, an hour, an eternity, and his silence was the cruelest judgment of all. It was not condemnation, but it was not acceptance either. It was a void. In his silence, she saw her own ruin reflected. She had brought death to his door. She had tainted his sanctuary with her own ugly past. He had saved her, and she had repaid him by putting a noose around his neck. The realization was a shard of ice in her heart. She couldn't stay. She couldn't ask him to carry this burden. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she stood up. He didn't move. She walked past him to the door, her bare feet silent on the rough wooden floor. She didn't take a coat. She didn't take her shoes. She simply opened the door and stepped out into the biting cold of the night. She expected him to call after her, to stop her, but the only sound was the soft click of the door closing behind her, shutting her out in the darkness. She ran. Her bare feet screamed in protest against the sharp stones and frozen ground. But she didn't stop. She ran from the cabin, from the man whose silence had broken her, from the ghost of Clarissa Belle Fairchild. Her only instinct was to flee, the same instinct that had driven her from her father's house. She made it to the edge of town as the first hint of dawn stained the eastern sky the color of a fresh bruise. A freight wagon was being loaded, its driver a heavy-set man with a florid face, preparing for an early start. It was heading east, back the way she came, but it was a way out. "Please," she begged, her voice a hoarse croak, her teeth chattering from the cold. "I need a ride, just to the next town. I can pay." She held out the last of her mother's jewelry, a small silver locket. The driver's eyes widened, not at the locket, but at her face. A slow, greasy smile of recognition spread across his features. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a low chuckle. He glanced around, then back at her. "I know you. You're the one on that flyer, the Fairchild woman." Terror, stark and absolute, seized her. She tried to turn, to run, but he was too fast. He lunged, grabbing her arm in a punishing grip. "That reward will buy me a whole new wagon," he snarled, his other hand fumbling for the pistol at his belt. She reacted without thinking. She brought her knee up hard into his groin, and as he grunted in pain and his grip loosened, she bit down on the fleshy part of his hand, tasting the salt of his blood. He yelled, a string of curses, and shoved her away. She stumbled backward, falling hard on the frozen ground. He raised his hand to strike her, but the sound of an approaching horse made him pause. She scrambled to her feet and fled, not looking back. She ran past the last of the town's buildings and into the dark, tangled woods that bordered the river. She ran until her lungs were on fire and her legs would no longer obey her, collapsing in a heap of raw-nerved exhaustion under the skeletal branches of a cottonwood tree. There, she curled into a small ball, bruised and trembling, and waited for the end. She must have slept or passed out, because the next thing she knew, the morning sun was filtering through the branches, and a shadow had fallen over her. She looked up, her body tensing, expecting to see the leering face of the wagon driver or the cold eyes of a bounty man. But it was Silas. He stood over her, his horse a few feet away. His face was haggard in the morning light, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. He looked down at her bruised face, her torn dress, her bare, bleeding feet. A great, shuddering sob broke from her, a sound of utter defeat. "I can't," she gasped, the words torn from the deepest part of her. "I can't hide from you anymore." He knelt in the dirt beside her, and his hands, calloused and rough, came up to cup her face. He held her as if she were something precious, something fragile that might shatter at a single touch. His kiss was not like the others. It was not born of passion or anger. It was rough, broken, and full of a shared, aching pain. It was a kiss that tasted of loss and regret, but also of a terrible, binding solace. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. "We ride west," he said, his voice a low rasp. "We'll find a place so deep in the territories that no one will ever find you. You can change your name. We can start over." It was the offer of a lifetime, the escape she had been dreaming of. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the truth. Running was not a solution. It was just a different kind of prison. The fear would always follow. "No," she whispered, the word surprising her as much as it did him. She pulled herself up, wincing as her bruised body protested. "I'm tired of running. Silas, I've been running my whole life." A new resolve, fragile but fierce, hardened within her. "But I don't want to be caught." He watched her, his gaze intense. Searching her face, he saw the shift in her, the flicker of a new strength forged in the crucible of her confession and despair. He saw the woman she was, not the ghost she had been pretending to be. He stood up and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. His grip was firm, steady, a promise. "All right, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "We stay. We stand. But you need to know, this town won't forget, and they sure as hell won't forgive." Silas's warning proved to be not a prophecy, but a simple statement of fact. The decision to stand their ground had been made in the cold isolation of the woods. Its consequences would be delivered in the hot, suffocating judgment of the town. The following Sunday, Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was matched only by his theatricality, called a town meeting. It was not announced as a trial, but everyone knew that was what it was. The church was packed, the air thick with the scent of starched linen, sweat, and self-righteousness. Clara and Silas sat alone in the back pew, a wide, empty space on either side of them creating an invisible quarantine. Clara kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. The Reverend stood at the pulpit, his Bible held aloft like a weapon. He did not speak of forgiveness or redemption. He spoke of pestilence. He spoke of a serpent entering their humble garden, a fallen woman who had not only sinned but had brought the shadow of a hangman's noose into their community. He did not use her name. He did not have to. He called her the Jezebel, the harbinger of discord, his voice rising and falling in a practiced, damning cadence that sent shivers of fear down Clara's spine. When he finally fell silent, his point made and his congregation suitably stirred, a single voice rose from the silence. "That's not fair." It was Mrs. Lowry. She stood up, her small, severe frame trembling slightly, but her voice was firm. "I won't speak to the woman's past, because it's not my business to know, but I will speak of what I do know. I gave her a job when she had nothing. She worked harder than any 2 boys I could have hired. She never complained, never shirked, and never asked for a thing she didn't earn. I don't know about serpents, Reverend, but I know a good worker when I see one, and I know a soul being kicked when it's already down." A shocked murmur rippled through the church. For a woman, and a shopkeeper dependent on goodwill, to speak against the Reverend was unheard of. Reverend Miller looked down at her with an expression of profound pity, as if she were a lamb who had just volunteered for the slaughter. "Charity of the heart is a virtue, Martha," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But blindness to wickedness is a sin." Mrs. Lowry sat down, her face pale, but her chin held high. The matter was settled. The town had its verdict. The next day, 2 of Mrs. Lowry's oldest customers informed her they would be taking their business to the next town over. She had defended the sinner, and now she would share in her punishment. Despite this, when Clara appeared at the back door of the store that morning, her face drawn and tired, Mrs. Lowry simply handed her an apron. "The floor needs sweeping," was all she said. Returning to work was an act of profound courage, and every moment was an agony. The women who came into the store would see her and turn away, waiting until Mrs. Lowry was free. Men would stare at her, their eyes filled with a new kind of appraisal, as if she were now public property. She was treated not like a person, but like a piece of dirt, something to be stepped around and ignored. She endured it with a quiet, stoic dignity, her movements precise, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. But inside, every averted gaze, every whispered comment, was another small cut. The whispers soon escalated to action. One evening, as she was sweeping up in the storeroom, a rock crashed through the small, grimy window, showering the floor with glittering shards of glass. It landed near her feet with a heavy thud, a clear and unambiguous message. She did not scream. She simply stood there for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she carefully swept up the glass, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the dustpan. The next morning, the word was painted on the back wall of the store in crude, white letters. Harlot. The word seemed to pulsate in the morning light, a public branding for all to see. That was the final straw for Silas. He rode into town that afternoon, his face like a thundercloud. He didn't go to the saloon or the store. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Clara watched him from the store window, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The confrontation was short and brutal. Silas's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, audible even from across the street. He demanded protection for Clara. He demanded that the sheriff find the men who were terrorizing her. Sheriff Brody's response was weary and predictable. He stood on the boardwalk, his hands spread in a gesture of helplessness. "What do you want me to do, Silas? I can't post a deputy to watch her every second of the day, and I sure as hell can't offer official protection to a wanted woman with a bounty on her head. My hands are tied. You brought this on yourself when you decided to keep her." Silas stood there for a long moment, his whole body radiating a silent, impotent fury. Then he turned, and without another word, swung up onto his horse and rode out of town. The law would not help them. They were on their own. That night, in the quiet of the cabin, he laid out the plan. It was desperate, morbid, and dangerous, but it was the only thing he could think of. "We have to kill Clarissa Fairchild," he said, his voice flat. Clara stared at him, her blood turning to ice. "What are you talking about?" "The bounty," he explained, his eyes intense. "It's the only reason anyone with a gun will come looking for you. It's the reason Brody won't help. If the woman on that flyer is dead and buried, the bounty goes away. The hunters will stop looking. You'll be safer." "But how?" she whispered, horrified. His plan was a ghastly piece of frontier ingenuity. He knew the undertaker in the next county. From time to time, a drifter or a prospector would die with no name and no family. These unclaimed bodies were buried in a pauper's field, their passing unlamented. Silas intended to procure one, a woman, if possible, of roughly her size and build. "We'll take it to that old abandoned line shack a few miles north of here," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur. "We'll put one of your old dresses on her, leave your locket, then we'll burn it. We'll burn it to the ground. An accident, a lamp overturned. No one will be able to identify the body for certain, but with the dress and the locket, it will be enough. Enough for the bounty men to collect their money and move on." The thought of it was sickening. Desecrating a grave, using a stranger's body as a prop in their desperate play. But as she looked at his face, she saw the grim necessity of it. He was right. As long as Clarissa Fairchild was alive, Clara Boone could never be safe. It took a week of tense, sleepless nights and anxious days. Then one night, Silas rode out and returned just before dawn with a long, heavy bundle wrapped in canvas and tied across the back of his spare horse. He did not tell her how he had gotten it. She did not ask. They rode to the abandoned shack under the cold, indifferent light of a full moon. The shack was a dilapidated structure, its wood dried to tinder by years of sun and wind. It was a perfect funeral pyre. Inside, by the light of a single lantern, they did the grim work. The body was a woman, her face gaunt and lifeless. Clara's hands trembled as she dressed the corpse in the simple dress she had worn when she first arrived in Mercy's Edge. It felt like dressing her own ghost, with a final, shuddering breath. She clasped her mother's silver locket around the dead woman's neck. "Are you ready?" Silas asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, unable to speak. They stepped outside, and he tossed the lit lantern through the open doorway. The dry wood and the oil from the lamp caught instantly. Flames licked up the walls, roaring to life with a terrifying hunger. Within minutes, the entire shack was a blazing inferno, casting a hellish, flickering light against the dark sky. They watched until the roof collapsed, sending a shower of sparks hissing into the night. Then they turned and rode away, leaving the fire to erase the woman who had brought them so much pain. The plan worked. 2 days later, a pair of hard-faced bounty hunters rode into town. Led by the smoke, they poked through the ashes, found the melted silver of the locket, and were satisfied. Sheriff Brody signed the necessary papers, and the men left, their saddlebags heavier and their quarry officially deceased. Clarissa Fairchild was dead, but her ghost still haunted Mercy's Edge. The townsfolk knew what Silas and Clara had done. They might not have known the details, but they knew a body had been burned, and they knew it was a lie. The judgment did not cease. It simply changed its flavor. Now, she was not just a harlot. She was a ghoul, living with a man who trafficked in the dead. The stares grew colder, the whispers more venomous. The fragile hope that the fire would cleanse her reputation was reduced to ash along with the shack. Clara retreated into herself, building a new wall, this one made of silence and sorrow. She continued to work for Mrs. Lowry, but she spoke only when necessary. Back at the cabin, she moved like a phantom, her smiles vanishing, her laughter a forgotten memory. The vibrant, defiant woman who had decided to stand and fight was disappearing, replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost. Silas, a man of action with no one left to fight, began to drink more heavily. The whiskey seemed to be the only thing that could dull the edges of his frustration and his fear for her. He would sit by the fire for hours, staring into the flames, a bottle of cheap rye his only companion. The silence between them grew, a chasm filled with unspoken resentments and shared despair. One night, another storm rolled in, the wind howling around the small cabin, rattling the windows like a trapped spirit. The storm outside was a mirror of the one that had been brewing inside for weeks. Silas was drunk, his movements clumsy, his words slurred. Clara watched him, her heart a tight, aching knot of misery. "Why do you do that?" she finally asked, her voice tight with unshed tears. "Why do you try to drown yourself every night?" He looked up at her, his eyes bleary. "Maybe I'm trying to drown you," he slurred. "The you that looks at me like I'm her jailer." The words were a slap, and they broke the dam of her control. "My jailer?" she cried, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "You're the one who regrets this. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me. You regret saving me. You regret not letting me run away when I had the chance. My God, you wish I had died in that fire." He slammed his fist on the table, the bottle rattling precariously. "Damn it, woman, that's not it," he roared, surging to his feet. The alcohol made his anger wild and unfocused. "You were safer then. You were safer when you were hidden, safer when you were a ghost. Look at you now. They've picked you apart until there's nothing left. I did all this to keep you safe, and you're more dead now than if a bullet had found you." His words were a brutal, twisted confession of his own pain, but all she heard was the accusation. She had failed him. She was not strong enough. She was the source of all their misery. With a choked sob, she turned and fled, throwing open the door and running out into the teeth of the storm. The wind tore at her hair, and the rain, cold as ice, plastered her thin dress to her skin. She didn't know where she was going. She was just running from the cabin, from him, from the truth of his words. In her blind panic, her foot slipped in the slick, churning mud. She went down hard, her leg twisting beneath her, and a sharp, searing pain shot up from her calf. She lay there for a moment, the cold mud sucking at her, the rain beating down on her face, and she wept. She wept for the woman she had been, for the woman she had become, and for the woman she would never be. A moment later, he was there, kneeling beside her in the mud, his face a mask of anguish in the dim light from the cabin door. He gently probed her leg. A long, deep gash on her shin was welling with blood, the result of a sharp rock hidden in the mud. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms, his touch surprisingly steady despite the whiskey, and carried her back inside. He set her down in a chair by the fire and began to clean the wound, his movements gentle and focused. The anger had drained out of both of them, leaving behind only a raw, aching sorrow. As he carefully wrapped a clean strip of cloth around her leg, she looked down at his bent head, at the dark, wet hair plastered to his skull, and a wave of profound, desperate love washed over her. She reached out and touched his cheek. He looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "I want to be yours," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Even if it kills me, I want to be yours." He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He leaned forward and kissed her, a slow, aching kiss that was an apology and a prayer. It was a kiss of utter surrender, a promise made in the heart of the storm. That night, their lovemaking was not the fierce, desperate clash it had been before. It was tender. It was a quiet, desperate search for solace, a gentle healing of wounds. In the darkness of the cabin, with the storm raging outside, they clung to each other as if they were the only two people left in the world. And in that shared, fragile embrace, a tiny, tentative glimmer of hope was rekindled. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a stubborn brawler, fighting its way through the last of winter's chill. The frozen mud softened. The creek began to swell with meltwater, and the sun, for the first time in months, held a genuine warmth. The air, which had been sharp and thin, now carried the scent of damp earth and the promise of new life. It was a season of tentative rebirth, and for a short, fragile time, the small cabin in the canyon felt its influence. They worked the land together. Silas, with his steady, powerful rhythm, broke the unforgiving soil with a pickaxe, his limp a testament to a past he never spoke of, but which no longer seemed to define him in the same harsh way. Clara followed behind him, her hands, once soft and pale, now chapped and strong. She crumbled the clods of earth, feeling the life in it, and planted the beans, one by one, in straight, hopeful rows. The physical labor was a balm. It was honest and clean, a welcome antidote to the poison of memory and judgment. It tired her body in a way that allowed her mind to rest. And for the first time since she had fled her gilded cage, a measure of peace began to settle in her soul. A smile, small and fragile at first, began to touch her lips. It would appear when a stubborn green shoot pushed its way through the dark soil, or when Silas, in a rare, unguarded moment, would make a dry, witty observation that caught her by surprise. He stopped drinking himself into a nightly stupor. He still drank, but it was a glass of whiskey now, not the whole bottle. He was a man coming back to himself, drawn out of the shadows by the quiet, steady presence of the woman who worked beside him. They were two broken things, slowly, painstakingly, beginning to mend in the spring sunlight. Their isolation was broken by the arrival of a new family, the Millers, who bought the small, abandoned homestead down the canyon. They were a cheerful, hard-working couple with a brood of sun-browned children, their laughter a welcome sound in the vast silence. They were new to the territory and blissfully unaware of the social currents of Mercy's Edge. They saw Silas and Clara not as an outcast and a harlot, but simply as their nearest neighbors. Mrs. Miller, a woman with a wide, easy smile, would sometimes bring over a fresh-baked loaf of bread. Her youngest daughter, a curious 6-year-old named Lydia, with eyes the color of a summer sky, took an immediate and fearless liking to Clara. One afternoon, while Clara was weeding the bean patch, Lydia approached her, her small fist clutching a freshly picked wildflower. "This is for you," the little girl said, holding out the small, purple blossom. Clara froze, her heart constricting. It had been so long since anyone had offered her a gift, a gesture of simple, unadorned kindness. She looked up and saw Mrs. Miller watching from a distance, a warm, encouraging smile on her face. With a trembling hand, Clara took the flower. "Thank you, Lydia," she whispered, her voice thick. "It's beautiful." Lydia beamed and then ran off to chase a butterfly, leaving Clara holding the small, perfect flower. It was a moment of grace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. But this small island of acceptance only served to highlight the vast ocean of condemnation that still surrounded them. When they rode into town, the Millers would wave cheerfully, but the rest of the townsfolk still crossed the street to avoid them, their faces set in grim, unforgiving lines. The brand had not faded. The fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday. A rider came into town, not a cowboy or a prospector, but a man who was jarringly out of place. He rode a fine, black Morgan horse with a silver-inlaid saddle and was dressed in an immaculate Eastern suit, a pearl-gray duster protecting him from the worst of the road's grit. He moved with an air of arrogant authority, his eyes sweeping over the dusty, primitive town with a look of undisguised disdain. Clara was in front of the general store, helping Mrs. Lowry unload a crate of tinned peaches. When he dismounted, he paused, removing his gloves with a slow, deliberate motion, and his eyes fell on her. For a moment, there was no recognition. Then, his gaze sharpened, his lips thinning into a tight, cruel line. He knew her. The blood drained from Clara's face. The crate of peaches slipped from her nerveless fingers, crashing to the boardwalk with a dull thud. It was William Thorne, Alistair Finch's right-hand man, and, more chillingly, his younger brother. He was the one who had always looked at her with a cold, reptilian hunger, the one whose presence had made her skin crawl even more than Alistair's. She felt like an insect pinned to a board, exposed and helpless under his cold, knowing gaze. Her past, the ghost she had tried so hard to bury, had just ridden into town on a black horse. She backed away slowly, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and fled into the store, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Silas found her in the storeroom, huddled behind a stack of grain sacks, trembling like a frightened rabbit. He had seen the man. He had seen the look on Clara's face. He didn't need to ask. "Stay here," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He turned and walked out of the store, his limp more pronounced, as it always was when he was angry. The confrontation took place in the middle of the street. Thorne had been about to enter the saloon, but Silas blocked his path. The town, sensing a storm, went quiet. People stopped what they were doing and watched from doorways and windows. "You've got no business here," Silas said, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his Colt. Thorne looked Silas up and down, his lip curling in a sneer. "I'm here on behalf of my brother. It seems a piece of his property went missing. I'm here to reclaim it." His eyes flickered toward the general store. "She's not property," Silas said, his voice dropping to that deadly quiet tone Clara knew so well. "And she's not going anywhere with you. Get on your horse and ride out. Now." Thorne laughed. A short, ugly sound. "You're the one they call Cain, aren't you? The killer? I'm not impressed. My brother has the law on his side. He has a contract. And he has a very long memory. You're harboring a fugitive, a thief, and an arsonist. That makes you a criminal." "I'm telling you for the last time," Silas said, his body going perfectly still. "Leave!" For a long moment, the two men stood frozen in a silent battle of wills. Thorne, for all his arrogance, was not a fool. He saw the absolute, uncompromising deadliness in Silas's eyes. He saw a man who had crossed lines he could not even imagine, with a final, contemptuous sneer. Thorne turned, swung gracefully into his saddle, and rode out of town, leaving a trail of dust and unanswered threats in his wake. Clara and Silas rode back to the cabin in a tense, heavy silence. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew this was not the end. Men like Thorne and his brother did not simply give up. When they arrived back at the cabin, Clara found it tucked under the door, a small, folded piece of expensive stationery. Her hands shook as she opened it. The note was short and clear. It was a list of demands, a sum of money, a fortune far beyond anything they could ever hope to possess, to be delivered in 1 month's time. If it was not paid, a letter detailing her location and the identity of her accomplice would be sent to every marshal and bounty hunter in the territory. It was not a bounty. It was blackmail, a slow, cruel poison. That night, the quiet peace of their small world was gone, replaced by the cold shadow of the gallows. Silas sat by the fire, staring into the flames, a bottle of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. Clara watched him, her heart aching with a guilt so profound it felt like a physical weight. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I've brought this on you. You should have let me go." He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes dark with a pain that seemed to go deeper than the current crisis. "No," he said, his voice rough. "You think you're the only one in this room with blood on your hands?" He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark, empty canyon. "I told you I was away when my brother died. I didn't tell you where." He took a deep breath, the confession he had held inside for years finally fighting its way to the surface. "I was fighting in the war. Not on the side you might think. I was a Union soldier." He spoke of the war not in terms of glory or honor, but in terms of mud, blood, and the soul-crushing exhaustion of seeing men do terrible things. He spoke of his commanding officer, a major with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, a man who believed the end always justified the means. "We were in Missouri," Silas said, his voice a monotone, as if he were reciting a story about someone else. "The fighting there was ugly, neighbor against neighbor. We were tasked with clearing out a small valley that was supplying Confederate guerrillas. We found the farm. There was no one there but an old man, a woman, and a handful of children. They swore they knew nothing." He paused, his jaw tight. The major didn't believe them. He gave an order to make an example of them. He ordered us to burn the farm and to leave no witnesses. The silence in the room was absolute. Clara felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "The other soldiers, they were just boys. They looked at each other, not knowing what to do. But I knew. I had seen what this man was. I had seen the pleasure he took in cruelty. I refused the order." His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. "He called me a traitor. He drew his pistol and aimed it at the woman. I was faster." He turned from the window and looked at her, his eyes filled with a decade of torment. "I shot him. My commanding officer. I killed him right there in that dusty farmyard. The other soldiers, they let the family go and we reported that the major had been killed by guerrillas. No one ever questioned it. But I knew. I deserted that night. I've been running ever since. That's why I couldn't go home. That's why I have this limp. It wasn't a battle wound. It was from a fall I took while I was running." He had revealed the deepest, darkest part of himself. He had laid his own monstrous secret at her feet, a grim offering to match her own. He expected her to recoil, to see him as a murderer, a deserter, a man beyond redemption. But Clara did not see a murderer. She saw a man who had made an impossible choice, a man who had sacrificed his honor, his home, and his future to save the innocent. She saw the true source of his pain, the wound that had festered in him for so long. She stood up and walked to him. She didn't speak. She simply took his hands in hers. They were large, scarred, calloused hands, hands that had planted beans and tended horses, Hands that had held her with a desperate tenderness, and hands that had killed a man. She lifted them to her lips and kissed the scarred knuckles, a gesture of profound, absolute acceptance. "We're both stained, Silas," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "But I would rather bleed beside you than live clean without you." A single, ragged breath escaped him, a sound of a burden finally being set down. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, and held her as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. The ghosts of their pasts were still there, still hovering in the shadows, but they were no longer alone with them. Later that night, they sat by the fire, the blackmail note lying forgotten on the table. They spoke in low voices, not of running, not of fighting, but of surviving. They planned a life, not a grand one, but a small, quiet one. They would add another room to the cabin. They would dig a well. They would live, day by day, side by side. Whatever came, a soft peace, more real and durable than any they had known before, settled over them. They had seen the worst of each other, and they had not turned away. And in that shared darkness, they had finally found a place to call home. The peace they had found was a fragile, living thing, a wildflower growing in the crack of a boulder. It had to be tended with a quiet, daily devotion. For 2 weeks after William Thorne's departure, life in the small canyon settled into a rhythm of hopeful domesticity. The bean shoots grew strong and green, a testament to their shared labor. The days were long and filled with the simple, satisfying work of survival. They repaired the roof of the small barn. They cleared stones from a new patch of land for a fall garden. And in the evenings, they sat on the small porch, not always speaking, but simply existing together in the vast, peaceful silence of the coming night. The threat of the blackmail note was a serpent coiled in a dark corner of their minds, but they refused to give it the power of their attention. They had 1 month of peace, and they chose to live in it. The day the serpent struck, Silas had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Clara alone at the cabin. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and a gentle breeze whispered through the pines. She was humming softly to herself, mending one of Silas's shirts, her needle moving with a practiced, steady rhythm. She felt a sense of ownership, of belonging, that was entirely new to her. This small cabin, this patch of stubborn land, was not a hiding place anymore. It was her home. The thought was so simple, so profound, it made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love. The sound of approaching horses, too many for a single rider, broke the spell. Her head snapped up, the needle poised in midair. Her first thought was of the millers, but the rhythm of the hooves was wrong. It was not the ambling gait of a family wagon, but the purposeful, steady tread of men on a mission. She stood up slowly, her half-mended shirt falling to the porch floor, and her eyes scanned the trail leading down into the canyon. It was him, William Thorne, and he was not alone. Flanking him were 2 men she had never seen before. They were not cowboys. They were dressed in dark, practical clothing, and they wore their guns with the grim competence of men who use them for a living. They looked hard and empty, their faces devoid of any emotion save a kind of bored cruelty. They were not bounty hunters. They were hired muscle, the old, familiar terror, the one she thought she had finally conquered, seized her with icy fingers. Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a heart-stopping moment, her only instinct was to run, to flee into the woods and disappear. But then another feeling, hot and powerful, rose to meet the fear. It was rage, a deep, primal anger. They had come to her home. They had come to destroy the one small piece of peace she had ever known, and she would not let them. She backed into the cabin, her eyes never leaving the 3 riders as they dismounted. Her mind raced. Silas was hours away. There was no one to help her. She was alone. The thought, which once would have sent her into a spiral of despair, now hardened into a cold, sharp point of resolve. Her eyes fell on the shotgun Silas kept mounted over the hearth. She had never fired a gun in her life. She had always hated the sight of them, the smell of them, the casual violence they represented. But now, it was her only hope. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy weapon from its pegs. It was surprisingly solid, the wood of the stock smooth and cool against her skin, the double barrels a dull, menacing gray. She fumbled with the shells he kept in a small leather pouch on the mantelpiece, her fingers suddenly clumsy and thick. She managed to break the gun open, slide 2 shells into the chambers, and click it shut. The sound was a final, definitive click of commitment. There was no turning back. She moved to the window, peering out from behind the edge of the rough curtain. Thorne and his men were walking toward the porch, their boots crunching on the gravel. "Clarissa Bell," Thorne called out, his voice dripping with a smug, oily confidence. "There is no need for this to be unpleasant. My brother is a forgiving man. He is willing to overlook your indiscretions. Just come outside, and we can all go home." Clara's knuckles were white where she gripped the shotgun. Home. The word was a vile mockery coming from his lips. "She's not coming out, boss," one of the hired men said, his voice a low growl. He drew his pistol and took a step toward the door. "Stay where you are." Clara's voice, when it came, was stronger than she expected. It cracked like a whip in the quiet air. "Take one more step, and I will shoot." The man paused, a flicker of surprise on his face. Thorne chuckled, a sound of genuine amusement. "My dear girl, you wouldn't know which end of that thing to point. Now stop this foolishness." To prove his point, the second man strode boldly onto the porch and kicked the cabin door. The wood splintered, the latch giving way with a sharp crack, and the door swung inward. Clara did not think. She reacted. She raised the shotgun, the butt of it clumsy and awkward against her shoulder, and pulled one of the triggers. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin, a roar of sound and fury that shook the very foundations of the building. The kick of the gun was a brutal, physical blow, sending a sharp, stabbing pain through her shoulder and knocking her back a step. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. She had missed. The blast tore a wide, ragged hole in the wall to the left of the doorway. But the message was clear. She was not bluffing. The man on the porch scrambled back, his face pale, his bravado gone. Thorne's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You foolish woman," he hissed. "You've just signed your own death warrant." He drew his own pistol. "And your lover's." They took cover, one man on either side of the doorway, trapping her inside. A tense, deadly standoff ensued. Clara stood in the middle of the room, her ears ringing, her shoulders screaming in protest, the heavy shotgun still clutched in her hands. She was terrified, but she was not broken. She was a she-wolf defending her den, and she would die here before she let them take her. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a new sound cut through the tension. The unmistakable sound of a single horse, ridden hard and fast. Silas. He appeared at the top of the canyon trail, taking in the scene in an instant. The 3 men, their drawn guns, the splintered door of his cabin. He did not slow down. He did not call out. He spurred his horse into a gallop, his right hand sweeping down to draw the Colt from its holster. The 2 hired men turned, surprised by his sudden, silent arrival. It was the only opening he needed. He fired from the saddle, his first shot catching the man on the right in the chest. The man grunted, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before collapsing in a heap on the ground. Silas swung off his horse before it had even come to a stop, using the animal for cover as the second man opened fire. A bullet whizzed past his head, and another thudded into the saddle. Thorne, a coward at heart, scrambled for his own horse, intent on fleeing. The second hired man charged, firing wildly. Silas moved with a deadly grace, his limp forgotten in the heat of battle. He fired twice more. The man cried out, clutching his leg, and went down, his pistol flying from his hand. The fight was over in less than a minute. A brutal, bloody explosion of violence that left the peaceful canyon ringing with the echo of gunshots. Silas stood over the wounded man, his face a grim mask of cold fury, his pistol still smoking. The other man lay still, his eyes open and unseeing, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. Thorne was already a distant plume of dust, fleeing for his life. Silas's eyes met Clara's through the shattered doorway. He saw the shotgun in her hands, the defiant terror in her eyes, the splintered wood, and he understood everything. He walked slowly into the cabin, holstering his pistol, and took the heavy gun from her unresisting hands. Her arms fell to her sides, the adrenaline suddenly draining away, leaving her weak and trembling. He didn't speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her and held her, his hand stroking her hair as she buried her face in his chest and began to sob. Great, shuddering gasps of relief and horror. Sheriff Brody arrived an hour later, drawn by a rider Silas had sent. He surveyed the scene with a weary, practiced eye, the dead man being loaded onto his horse, the wounded man groaning as Silas tied a tourniquet around his leg, the bullet holes in the cabin walls. He listened to Silas's account, his expression unreadable. When Silas was finished, Brody walked over to the dead man and pulled back the canvas. He looked at the man's face, then at the wounded man. "I don't know these men," he said, his voice flat. "They're not from around here. They're Easterners, by the look of them." He looked at Silas, then at Clara, who stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale but her eyes steady. "It seems to me," the sheriff said slowly, his voice carrying just enough for them to hear, "that some men from back east came out here looking for trouble. And they found it. This is our land. We deal with our own problems. We don't take kindly to city folk bringing their feuds and their hired guns to our doorstep." He turned to his deputy. "Cut him loose," he said, nodding at the wounded man. "And you," he said, his voice hard as iron. "You get on your horse and you ride out of this territory. You tell your employer that Clarissa Fairchild died in a fire. The matter is closed. If I ever see your face in this town again, I'll hang you myself for trespassing." He never looked at Clara or Silas again. He had not offered them a pardon. He had offered them something better. He had drawn a line in the dust, and he had placed them on the same side as the town. He had chosen them. The violence of that day shook Clara to her very core, but it did not break her. In fact, it forged something new within her. The last vestiges of the frightened, running girl had been burned away in the fire of the gun battle. She had fought for her home. She had fought for her life with Silas, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she would never run again. That Sunday, she walked into the church with Silas at her side. She did not sit in the back. She walked to the very front, her head held high, and turned to face the congregation. A shocked silence fell over the room. Reverend Miller, about to begin his sermon, stared at her, his mouth agape. "I have something to say," she said, her voice trembling but clear, carrying to every corner of the small church. And she told them everything. She spoke of her father, of the cruel man she was forced to marry, of the fire, of the bounty, of the blackmail. She did not ask for their pity. She did not ask for their forgiveness. She simply laid the truth before them, a humble, painful offering. "I am not the woman you have called me," she finished, her eyes sweeping over their faces. "I have made mistakes. I have lived in fear, but I am done with fear, and I am done with hiding. My name is Clara, and this is my home." When she was finished, the silence was profound. The town was a hung jury, their faces a mixture of shock, suspicion, and a grudging, newfound respect. Then, a figure moved from one of the pews. It was Mrs. Lowry. She walked to the front of the church and in front of God and everyone. She wrapped her arms around Clara in a fierce, protective hug. A few of the other women, their faces softening, gave small, hesitant nods of acknowledgement. And from the back of the church, an old rancher muttered to his neighbor, just loud enough to be heard, "She's braver than the lot of us." The town was still divided, but a crack had appeared in the wall of their judgment. It was a beginning. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the canyon, Silas took her hand. He led her to the porch, to the spot where they so often sat in silence. "I don't have much to offer you, Clara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "No fancy house, no fortune. This life, it will be hard. There will always be people who judge. There will always be scars." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a small, tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. It was old and worn, the surface smoothed by time. "This was my mother's," he said, his thumb brushing over the engraving. "It's all I have left of her. I've got no promises for you but this. My life is yours, if you'll have it, if you want it." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She wore a simple, mended dress. Her hands were calloused from work, and her shoulder ached from the kick of the shotgun. She had never been more beautiful. She took the locket, her fingers closing over his. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Oh, yes." She looked up into his eyes, her gaze fierce and full of love. "But you have to promise me something. Don't ever kiss me like you're leaving again." He smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached his stormy gray eyes and transformed his entire face. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was a promise of 1,000 sunsets to come. The final scene of their story was not an ending, but a beginning. They stood side by side on the small porch of their cabin as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and rose. Their bodies were bruised, their souls were scarred, but they were not broken. They were survivors. And as they stood together, their hands clasped, their eyes full of a fierce, quiet love, they knew they were finally home. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. Let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.